what you can really do by investing in customer feedback is that you can very quickly change the conversation. If you can really just spin up a test and come back with data, then suddenly it's not about my opinion versus your opinion. It's about, here's an idea, here's some data on how users responded, and based on that data, what actions are we going to take? I think the most important thing is you can just fundamentally change the discussion and change the conversation by basing it on data as opposed to someone's feelings or opinions, which is an entirely different world.
Welcome to the Human Insight Podcast, where we help you bridge the empathy gap to bring you a valuable, new understanding of some of the most innovative ideas and trends shaping the future of business and customer experience.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janelle Estes, Chief Insights Officer at UserTesting, and today we're very excited to have Andrew Frueh joining us on the Human Insight Podcast. Andrew is the SVP of User Experience at Health Catalyst. Thanks so much for joining us today, Andrew, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Janelle. It's an honor to be talking.
Awesome. So you're currently SVP of User Experience at Health Catalyst. Can you tell us a bit about your company, your role, and maybe even how that role has evolved over time?
I had the pleasure of being a part of Health Catalyst for almost 8 years now. And so Health Catalyst, it's a data and analytics company. So we work primarily for large healthcare organizations. So, there's a lot of data that flows through healthcare ever since the advent of electronic medical records. And, a lot of that data is being stored, but is sort of sitting in like a warehouse somewhere. And Health Catalyst, as much as we're a data company, we like to think of ourselves as an outcomes company. So for example, you could kind of think about it as we're collecting all this data, but ultimately we want to be able to work with our customers to enact outcomes like how can we reduce the length of stay for patients with such and such a condition or in such and such a department. And so, our business is certainly data and analytics, but at the end of the day, the way that we measure ourselves is, in quality of life improvements or lives saved. In a lot of ways, it's actually not too dissimilar from the way that UserTesting tries to provide a data-driven approach to design. We try and bring a data-driven approach to healthcare.
Yeah, I love the way you framed that up, and it makes a lot of sense. Can you tell us a little bit about your role as SVP
Sure.
of User Experience?
Yeah, right. Great question. I was the basically designer number one at Catalyst. So when I started, it was really specifically focused on an individual product. It was kind of right as Health Catalyst was starting to sort of turn a corner from being, I guess, what you would consider more of a services company to being more of a products company. Probably worth mentioning that we do kind of still have a split house in some ways, services and products. We were really sort of starting our journey down being a products company. And so, like I say, I started really focused on the design of a specific product, but it became pretty clear pretty early on that there was a need for this in other places around the company. So I sort of started functioning a little bit like kind of like a miniature agency within Health Catalyst, sort of like as a designer working with a lot of different teams. Little by little, it became a matter of sort of fashioning the work that we were doing into standards that could be applied across the company. And then, as we became more of a design-centric organization, building that design culture, bringing other designers into the mix, and for a good portion of our time as a product company, we functioned with a kind of decentralized model where I kind of sat in the middle, kind of looking over design across Catalyst. And then we had individual designers who sat on specific product teams who were, reported up through that product team's organization. And we had like a dotted line relationship to each other. But it's only been really in the past year or so where we realized that there were just a lot of efficiencies kind of being lost as the company grew. And there were, pockets of the company where design just didn't have a reach into. And we realized that if we came together as a centralized team, there were more opportunities to kind of expand, to scale a little bit more. And so So now we're a centralized UX team. Our designers all kind of have primary responsibilities. So a lot of the teams that they were reporting to before still tend to be their primary focus. We've been really happy to see the way that coming together as a centralized team has just accelerated the knowledge sharing, the collaboration between our different designers. It's one of these things that's so intangible, but has been really encouraging to see just the way that something is like, that seems as like trivial as like an official relationship versus a dotted line relationship can change the way that like a team interacts with each other. And so, yeah, that's kind of where we are right now. And so, yeah, I kind of sit at the top of that. And then, we have our design team within there and continuing on our journey as growing a design organization within Health Catalyst.
Yeah, that's amazing that you've actually had that journey of starting out as the sole designer and then going through and evolving through the different models, almost, while being part of that whole growing up, if you will.
Yeah. And I mean, you and I had talked about this at one other point. And I think the thing that's been so interesting about that for me is that like over the course of my tenure at Health Catalyst, it really doesn't feel like I've worked for the same company the whole time. Like we were about 200 people when I started, and we're almost 1,400 now. And just sort of like the dynamics of being a private company and being a public company, it's all been interesting and has its own sets of really unique and exciting sort of like problems to chew on along the way, things to learn, things to do better. It hasn't been boring, that's for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say never a dull moment. So in terms of help me understand how the UX team is set up, you've got the group, you've got designers. Do designers also, are they the ones that are gathering the customer feedback, or do you have people dedicated just to that role? Like, what's the makeup of the UX team?
Yeah, so we're a small group. We unfortunately don't really have the luxury of distinguishing between specific UX researchers and UX designers. I could use the word full stack designers, right? We kind of, for better or for worse, have to wear all those hats. We do have on our product teams people who are product managers, the sort of like the holy trinity, right? Where you've got engineering, product, and UX. We try and still keep that set up on all of the product teams, even in the situation where it's like a centralized UX person or even a centralized product person, try and make sure that relationship kind of exists in all those situations. So the burden of requirements gathering is usually kind of a shared one between product and UX. When it comes to sort of the tactical side of things, when it's like, how we're going to implement a feature and we're down to sort of straight usability testing, I mean, that's pretty much clearly the domain of UX. But at the more like strategic level, it's usually kind of a shared responsibility.
From what I'm hearing from you, your structure is very common. It's interesting. You said we don't have the luxury of having a role dedicated to that. I feel like that would be a fun debate to have. Maybe not here on this podcast, but does it make sense to have a separate researcher? Or is that something that the larger product organization owns? I mean, I can see both sides, but
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels to me like the risk that I've seen in other organizations that have just really well-defined research teams, well-staffed research teams, is that you run the risk where the research becomes almost like an academic pursuit, where you do the research, kick it over the fence to the team, and then just cross your fingers that it's going to get implemented into something meaningful. And I guess having it be a split role does sort of knock down that barrier between doing work that by necessity kind of needs to be actionable, So I think that's probably a benefit, but of course the degree or the depth to which we can go in on is a little bit different. I mean, so we've kind of learned over time that we get the most bang for our buck really focusing on microtesting as opposed to just like big longitudinal benchmark style studies, because as much as the data that we have collected from doing benchmark studies can be meaningful, sometimes finding ways to get it into the backlog, get it into the roadmap can be a real challenge. Whereas if we focus on, this is the thing that the team's working on right now, and this is the thing that we can help drive decisions or drive the direction with that research, I think that's really where we found the sweet spot is for incorporating research into our design process.
Well, it probably also makes you feel more part of the shared team and the shared responsibility, because you're all working together to sort of make that decision and move along in the process. I think, yes, benchmark testing and longitudinal and those things are very meaningful and can be so helpful for understanding context and looking at competitors and all of that.
Sure.
But the reality is, you're right, it's harder, I would say, to actually action on that. So the idea of
totally.
microtesting, I like that phrase.
Yeah, I think I maybe picked that up from somebody who I had been talking to through user testing, but I think it really does kind of encompass what I feel like. Because I think in the early days, even when Health Catalyst started working with UserTesting.com, we were pretty early in trying to incorporate like voice of user into our design process. And I think have certainly looked up to and spent a lot of time reading books like Don't Make Me Think or Rocket Surgery Made Easy, all the Steve Krug models of like how to do testing and everything. And we've certainly had gone down that road of just sort of building tests that way and doing them at like our yearly conference. And the struggle was that you would do the research and we would quantify it and we would go to as great lengths as we could to, turn this into something, like, again, the Steve Krug thing, like pick the 3 most simple things on this list. And we would have our debriefs with the teams. You'd see a lot of nodding heads and a lot of agreement. And like, this was such a great exercise. Thank you for doing this. And then I would find that I still would have to check in like a month later, 3 months later, 6 months later, and we still haven't implemented that thing that we learned 6 months ago. Because our teams have to live in the real world and they've got 1,000 things on their backlog that are sometimes even just slotting in some quick fixes. Honestly, sometimes the way that some of those fixes happen was that engineers would be sitting on those benchmark tests and they would just like make the fix while they were sitting there, like listening to the call or something. And that was the way it would get done, But honestly, like I've just felt like the way that our team could really like drive meaningful design improvements was to just focus on those sort of like quick hit type things, whether it's like a question that comes up in the design process or it's a feature that we know we're going to implement, and then just spend the time figuring out the optimal way to do this one button on this one page. And like, we'll get that right. And we'll worry about the benchmark tests when the time is right for that too.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. Staying in the moment, if you will.
Yeah, very zen. Yep.
So tell me a little bit about metrics or KPIs of like how your team directly or indirectly influences the business. Like how do you map what you do to the larger strategy and purpose at Health Catalyst?
Yeah, I think this is such a good question because I think quantifying UX is a real challenge. And I think for all of us who run UX teams, I think it's still, it's certainly something that I think is on everybody's mind. I had the chance to attend a Jared Spool seminar just this past month, and he had some interesting ideas about getting away from quantifying value by like how many tests we run or how many page hits we get and moving towards sort of starting with the question of how do we make users' lives better? And then how can we quantify that? And I like that idea. And certainly like it's one of our team's big goals for the coming year to sort of really sit down and spend more time clearly defining KPIs for the team. But I want to be totally honest with you and not just give you a spin answer here, because I think I always find that it's most interesting to listen to other folks, other peers who are kind of have to like deal with the same problems I do. So, like I say, at Catalyst, we're a pretty small design team. We're, depending on how you count, we're 10 to 15 design professionals for a company of about 1,400 people. So whatever that ratio is, it's not huge. So the honest truth is that probably our biggest KPI to date has been how much of what Health Catalyst customers are seeing has UX had a hand in? Like, in other words, how much of the company are we covering? And like I say, in the very early days when it was just me, like that necessarily had to be pretty small because I knew that like if I tried to swallow the ocean, I would fail, I think either by necessity or just by personality, like my approach to sort of like building up design at Catalyst has very much been a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down one, kind of focusing on doing the best work that we could on the projects that we decided to tackle. And then hopefully you kind of build an appreciation for design by demonstrating its value in the work. And then, little by little, good work gets noticed. And, design culture sort of grows up that way, where it's sort of like, you notice that this thing is sort of like functioning better or being better received than this other thing. And then the question kind of naturally gets asked about how did that go that's different than this? And so it's been really nice to see how that has gone. I really think that looking back on it, if I had come in as that like sole designer in the early days, just like all guns blazing, like this is the way we're going to do it, you must all follow these edicts, I think we were still so early in our journey there that I think it would have kind of just like, it would have either fallen on deaf ears or just sort of like led to more barriers when we really were at a point where we needed to be really quick and nimble. And it was like so many of the things that we were learning were sort of necessarily like emergent, right? The definition came as we did it. And over time, we were able to codify that as opposed to the opposite. So, I mean, the old cliche, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's definitely something that kind of like takes time, and you have to be willing to sort of go along for the ride there and not be discouraged that these things take time. But yeah, like I say, I think it's been great to watch the appreciation for design grow. And I think especially as a centralized team now, there is a lot more opportunity for us to try and like really start to quantify more tangible metrics around it. But like I say, like just kind of like to some degree, we're kind of at a point now where we do have a degree of coverage, I would say, pretty much across the organization. Could it be bigger in places? Like, I think there's plenty of product managers who would argue the answer is yes. You know, again, sort of talking about the things that we have the luxury of. I've always been in a position where it's kind of like doing the most with what we have, as opposed to sort of going and making demands and then, building a team that way.
Yeah, it's almost like you're looking at, I don't know, would we say reach or sort of involvement?
Sure.
You know, how you're influencing certain decisions. I think it's a smart way to look at it. And, you know, you're still on your journey, building that culture. And the reality is, like, you hire 1 or 2 or 5 UX people and things aren't going to change overnight. It is,
totally.
It takes time. Yeah, it's helpful I'm sure helpful for listeners too, to hear how you think about it. And sure, you'll get to a point where does it make sense to map yourself to, some harder KPIs, or even build your own framework. I mean, you've got Tomer's HEART framework, for example, that I've seen be successful at plenty of companies. So there's many ways to do it. But I think the first step, or one of the many steps, I guess, is actually just getting people to embrace you.
I think that's absolutely true. And I feel like it's one of those steps that almost gets skipped over sometimes when we're kind of like pontificating on design, right? It depends on the company and depends on the culture, right? But I suspect a lot of organizations there, especially for designers who are coming into a space where they're the first one on the ground, right? Like that, I think depending on how the organization's set up, I think that's like, that is a real step. And I think if you can build a firm foundation there, like your ceiling is so much higher than if it's sort of just a surface level appreciation, or it's a soundbite or something like that.
Yeah. So switching topics here. So you've been in the healthcare space, B2B space, for the majority of your career. And these are different than consumer experiences. Of course, you have obviously the business element, but then you also have certain restrictions or constraints with the healthcare space. So can you talk a little bit about, like, when it comes to customer centricity, when it comes to customer experience, like what's unique about healthcare and B2B, and how might it compare to other industries like retail or even financial services?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, healthcare UX is a pretty unique space. There's not nearly enough of us practicing within this industry. And it's like, I'd like to hope that in the next decade, that changes a ton, because potentially because of the regulation and because of the cost associated, a lot of the sort of best practices that we would consider to be like second nature in consumer product UX, we're 5 years behind sometimes in healthcare, which is a real shame, because this is like literally life-saving technology. So you're absolutely right. Lots of regulations, and I think we're probably pretty similar to finance in that way, and also just like the complexity of the data and privacy concerns, HIPAA, all of these things are just a day-to-day. There's definitely a domain expertise that comes along with working in healthcare. And some of that is just even the superficial kind of being able to speak the language of the industry, which I don't know that is unique, but I think, healthcare certainly has it. I would say, like, I remember situations working as a creative director in agency settings where it kind of feels like the first conversations you're having with a new customer, they're kind of feeling out whether you know the acronyms or can speak the language, or whether you're sort of like part of the club in a way. So there's absolutely acquired domain expertise that comes along with working in healthcare for a while. The B2B thing and healthcare thing, I'm going to mix them together a little bit because I think there probably are some direct to consumer healthcare products which would be closer to other consumer products. So I think my experience has primarily been in the B2B healthcare space. So, I mean, in that sense, I mean, we're rarely trying to convert like sales, like the software is the product. So we're not trying to make conversions like you would at a retail type setting. And actually, I mean, as I kind of said at the beginning, it's not even the software that's the product, it's the outcomes that are the product in the case of what Health Catalyst does. So in that sense, I think it's actually quite interesting and potentially kind of unique the space that we work in, because we have a much smaller user base. And we also have a pretty strong distinction between the buyer and the user. In our case, the buyer is not the user in almost all situations. And in many cases, they're very different from each other. And so that creates some pretty interesting discussions between, strategy versus implementation and sort of how you sell something as opposed to just like how you actually build something. And so that's a very unique challenge. As I would kind of add to that too, I would say to some extent, if we deploy a tool that like 5 analysts use at a hospital system, but that leads to an intervention that saves X number of lives and saves Y number of dollars, then that was a successful product engagement, even though we had 5 users of the product, right? So I think that's a pretty big difference than the space that a lot of consumer products have to operate in. So you can imagine it can be quite a bit trickier for us to run like a A/B test on different user populations when we're working with such a niche audience. The thing that I wanted to kind of throw into the mix there by way of like color commentary is, I think in the UX field, we often hold up the practices of sort of like the big Silicon Valley UX teams as like the gold standard. And no question, like the surgical approach that a lot of those groups can take to UX is really enviable. But I think for a lot of years at Health Catalyst, I was trying to kind of put a round peg in a square hole as far as that goes. I was trying to apply the practices of B2C company in a B2B space. And as a result, I think I was missing a really great opportunity that was kind of right in front of my face. Because we have a really targeted, smaller user base, our users are potentially a lot closer to us than they would be in a B2C situation. So we have the opportunity to have really direct, meaningful connections with our customers in a way that you might not get to in a B2C situation. And I think it's funny because in the past, we'd have conversations about how to streamline the delivery of content for the sake of scale. I think we overlook the fact that in many ways, the secret sauce for a company like Health Catalyst, the thing that's made us successful in a lot of ways, is the person-to-person connections that we kind of foster, especially being kind of a split product services company. There's oftentimes there's no product engagement without some degree of service engagement, right? Because they're sort of like, I've got all this data, but how do I interpret it? And so maybe that's the clinical team working with them in terms of how that can lead to an intervention. So for example, many times when a customer has a question about our product, instead of digging into our documentation or going to one of our community sites, their first instinct is to just reach out to their customer success lead, like our account managers. And for a long time, we would talk about that like that was a bad thing or like a problem we have to solve. But I think in a lot of ways, that type of relationship is really what's kind of made us successful, And so I think what that's kind of crystallized in my head over time is that UX at Health Catalyst is in an amazing position to facilitate more and more of those person-to-person connections because we aren't product owners and we aren't the engineers. We can be kind of like an honest broker when it comes to interacting with customers, hearing their opinions, talking about how they implement solutions. Something I've learned a lot from the UserTesting.com team is in how you all have approached your customer advisory boards. What I love about what you do is I love the way that you create a space basically for design professionals to talk candidly amongst each other. And you kind of just get out of the way and facilitate that conversation. And I think we've heard from our customers that there's just a real hunger for that same kind of connection because a lot of them are kind of on islands within their organizations as well. Facilitating the connections between users now, not buyers, again, in this case, because I think UX is in the really great position to connect users to users, whereas a lot of our other groups are focused on buyers to buyers. And so, yeah, that's like, I mean, as I move into sort of next year and thinking about immediate goals for me and the UX team at Catalyst is really amplifying and facilitating more of those direct interactions between customers, because I feel like that's just one of those things that like maybe you don't have it just wouldn't be possible when you have hundreds of thousands of users. But when we're smaller, we would almost be missing an opportunity not to take advantage of that. Pros and cons, but I think the most important thing is recognizing the space that you're in, and then like not trying to make it something that it's not, but trying to work as effectively within the sort of like rules of engagement within that space.
Yeah, I love your point around you kind of starting out and trying to sort of apply what you see, what you were reading or seeing for best in class UX teams that exist in other companies. And I think probably many people have tried to do that. And the reality is like, you have to sort of assess, your working environment, the space you're in, the industry, what's going to be appropriate for the team and where they're at, and kind of go from there. But it's
for sure. I mean,
it's very humbling to kind of look back at that, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's great for inspiration always that we can sort of hear how everybody's approaching it in their own situations. But yeah, I think just appreciating that I don't think there ever is like a one size fits all for a UX organization at any company. It's just like it's so driven by like the space, the dynamics of the just the personality of the company in some ways can drive it a lot too. So yeah, I think the sooner that especially like UX leaders can sort of realize that taking the pulse of where you are and then, applying what you can of the books you're reading and the things you're hearing, but recognizing that your own implementation of that is going to be your own, and it should be.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned your team is 10 or 15 people. You're supporting an organization of 1,400. So you got a lot going on. You got a lot of different stakeholders, people that you're supporting. And when you think about, your impact and creating, a great experience, seamless designs, how have you and your team approached this at Health Catalyst? Like essentially, like how are you scaling yourself and your team?
Yeah, this is kind of fun because right now we're moving a little bit from like strategy to tactics. And that's certainly where my heart lies. This has evolved just like everything else that in the early days, it was one thing and it's something very different now, but has also been kind of driven by the company scaling and the UX team trying to keep measure with that. So when I first started early days, and I was working on that very first product I was working on at Catalyst, was approached by our COO about developing a digital style guide for the company. And I had to just sort of say to him, I could do that, but I just don't even know what would go in there right now, because I don't think we know what a Health Catalyst application is at this point. And so it would kind of be just coming up with standards for standards' sake at this point. So he graciously backed off on that and gave us the time to sort of get a few cycles of product development under our belt before we really took the step to start to formalize some design standards around what makes up a Health Catalyst application. And, again, in the early days, sort of just taking it one step at a time, we started just with like the PDF version of a style guide, which I think probably every company has at some point in their history had some version of. And we version controlled the PDF, right? So it was kind of at least in some, methodical state of evolution. But what we ran into, adoption wasn't a problem. Teams were really excited to have those things to follow because it's one less thing for them to think about. But what I was finding is it was creating a certain amount of oversight responsibility then for our very small team at that point, because for every like button standard, say, that was in the PDF, there were 12 different implementations of that on different teams. And it led to sort of a certain amount of spot checking, like, is that actually 5 pixel rounding or did you do 7 pixel rounding over there or something? And everything more or less looks the same, but it's kind of not the same. And so we were kind of like in the ballpark, but I think as anybody else who's a UX professional can appreciate, sometimes those are even more like nails on a chalkboard when it kind of looks right, but it's not exactly right. Like those can be even worse than just glaringly wrong, right? The opportunity we had to really sort of take the next step on that was when all of our CTO at the time just made the sort of difficult decision to say all of our product teams needed to align under one tech stack, which, might sound crazy, but in our early days, again, it was a little bit of Wild West, right? So we had a lot of different product teams using different technologies, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity to necessarily share. But when all of Health Catalyst aligned under the Angular framework, it meant all of a sudden, like there's something connecting all of these tools together, and we can now think about sharing a UI library. That sort of started us down really interesting course of building what now exists as our design system today at Catalyst. And we're hardly the first company to ever come up with our own design system, but I think it's a kind of interesting story because, again, to the sort of concept that every company kind of has their own path to go down. In the case of our design system, we as a UX team didn't have any dedicated development resources that we could apply to working on this. And so again, just kind of out of necessity, we have an innovation day once a month at Catalyst that we call Open Space. We had a session in Open Space several years ago where we brought together front-end developers from a lot of different teams across the company and just said, hey, we think this is probably a good time for us to try and start pulling together a UI library that everybody can share. So you guys, hopefully you're kind of like not reinventing the wheel every time you need to make a button or a popover or something like that. And so Health Catalyst was kind enough to allow us to do that in an open source fashion because, we really wanted this to just be something that everybody can kind of have a hand in, feel like everybody has some agency in the development of this. And we even had visions of sort of making this something that like the community could, pull from, that it wasn't just Health Catalyst per se. But anyway, so we approached it that way. There was a ton of like early energy around building this thing up, lots of people contributing, lots of excitement from just sort of like something new starting. And in my mind, I think in the early days, I was mostly concerned about just having alignment visually around similar things, but what we learned pretty fast as people started contributing to the library was that a UI library, or I would say even a design system to a large degree, is a little bit like a glacier where like what you see is just that bit that's above the water, but everything that's below the water is in many ways the driver between success and failure of like whether people are going to adopt this UI library or engage. And what I mean by that is like the quality of the code, quality of the documentation, the design support, the development support. There's just so much sort of rigor that if it's not there, it at best is frustrating to developers. At worst, can be a huge business problem because if you release a UI library that everybody's using and it introduces new bugs, you just broke all of your tools or something like that, So there's a real burden to make something that's, if not bulletproof, as close as possible. So, we had to sort of start formalizing some things like putting a steering committee together to ensure that there were standards in place that we were following. And, we kind of did that by pulling like one lead developer from all the different product teams to kind of have some say in how that worked. We had to figure out ways to sort of automate some of the documentation that we were doing around the tool. We also kind of had to learn what our developers wanted in terms of documentation. And, in the early days, we thought just having good API documentation, like just documenting the parameters that went into something was the most important thing. But what we have come to learn is that really like what most of the developers that we work with want are just examples, like just show me examples of how this works so I can just copy and paste this thing and put it in. And we've kind of come to realize in the page for our design system, like if there's not an example for a feature, it's almost like it doesn't exist because it's like, if they can't see it there, then it's like probably buried somewhere else in API documentation that no one has time to read. So that was a huge step forward, kind of formalizing that. But then if I kind of like fast forward the story here a little bit, what's been really cool is as Kashmir has become more mature, it was originally primarily focused on our web development teams. But Health Catalyst, as I said, we're products and services, and we're not just web applications. We work with a lot of business intelligence tools like Tableau, Power BI, and we have teams that are doing knowledge development, like I say, around like sort of clinical topics and a lot of other corners of the house that aren't touched by web development, but sort of realizing that Kashmir had kind of become a standard that made a lot of sense to be applied in other ways around the company. And so then taking the germ of this design system, which was really just a UI library to start out with, and then has over time become something more like a design system as we've brought like our technical writers into the fold, and they have a corner of Kashmir now, and bringing our analytics services organization into it and defining how can we sort of take these standards that were originally designed for web apps and apply them to like a Tableau template. And so how can we make sure that Health Catalyst analytics tool that's being deployed in Tableau really looks and feels as much as possible with the web application as well. And so sort of seeing the design system kind of grow that way. I mean, 100%, that has become the way that the UX team has managed, I think, to scale itself and continue to scale itself through the organization. We kind of treat it like a product almost at this point. Like actually, Kashmir is actually in our product plan tool as like a dependency that kind of sits in a lot of other products backlogs, that it's sort of like we expect if they need a feature to be built, like Kashmir is going to try and maintain that. And so, yeah, I think that the way that the design system has kind of become our product, if you want to think about it that way, has played a big role in how we've been able to sort of like work as a small group within a much bigger company.
Yeah, I mean, that's no small feat. I mean, you've accomplished a ton by building that. I also wonder too, like, and you've probably already thought of this, but you've introduced so much, consistency to the experience, of course, but also efficiency. I think when we chatted before, you were talking about how, there are analysts involved that don't really, this isn't their expertise. And if they can go
Sure.
grab the resources they need, it saves them a ton of time and a ton of thought process. So could be another angle to look at, like ROI and metrics and things like that.
That's a great one. And of course, like the challenge, of course, is like how to like really quantify that. But I think you're absolutely right. And it was very eye-opening to me too, just how much we were asking our analysts to be designers. I mean, they had to put a tool out there. And so there was no way around the fact that they had to somehow design it, but oftentimes when I think someone's asked to sort of be a designer without having had any design training, you're kind of at the whim of whoever is calling the shots there, right? Whoever's running the project or paying the money. I think the thing that we really struggled with a lot of our analytics tools in the early days was just that sense of trying to throw everything under the sun into it, right? Just like every filter and every toggle and every metric and, these just giant overloaded dashboards. And that's just one of those things, again, where we can sort of free up the space for our analysts to focus on the things that they're really good at and sort of give them some of the tools to just get past that sort of blank sheet of paper phase. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think our analysts don't want to be the designer, I think they're happy to have input into that space. The thing that they're so good at is being able to pull these insights from just these vast pools of data. And we just want to equip them to focus their time on the thing that is most meaningful.
Awesome. Well, we're going to switch gears a little bit to what we call the lightning round. So we do this with every guest that comes on the show. Ask them the same questions. Is there a book that you've recently read that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I appreciate this one because I'm a big reader. So I will also say that when I read, it's usually for entertainment. So I'm going to go two angles on this one. I'll give you the book my favorite book of the year. And then I assume you're probably looking to some degree on books that are relevant to the topic here. So I'll give you both. My favorite, I'm a big sci-fi fantasy guy. There's a book called Gideon the Ninth, which I just finished recently by Tamsin Muir. It is the most original gonzo, just original, incredible story. And I highly recommend the audiobook version of that. The narrator is incredible. If you're looking for books that are more on a design angle, we spend a lot of time thinking about data visualization at Catalyst, as you might imagine. So I've got two that I really love there. We kind of did a book club in our UX team on one recently called Effective Data Storytelling by an author named Brent Dykes. It's the subtext is how to drive change with data, narrative, and visuals. That's kind of like right in our sweet spots. Learned a ton from how he approached that. And then the other one is kind of just my go-to. It's a book called Good Charts by an author named Scott Baronato. It's like the Harvard Business School Press, I think, publishes that one. But it's like there are many, many tomes out there, like academic treatises on like, data visualization. And I like that Scott Baronato wrote a book that's really, it's about like a half an inch thick compared to like 5 inches thick, and he distills a lot of really useful practical data visualization techniques. And it's the one that when I teach courses on data viz, that's the one I reference the most. So that's a great one. And just day to day, The Economist magazine does a newsletter called Off the Charts, where they do a deep dive like once a month into a piece of data viz that they did, which is always super fun to read because they get really down into the weeds, like very nerdy stuff. And it's a lot of fun if you're interested in that.
Oh, I definitely want to check out that newsletter. Also, that last book that you mentioned, The Good Charts, I feel like every person who works on a presentation sounds like they should be reading that book.
Yeah, we all kind of play in the data viz world.
I have an appreciation for great visualizations because they're kind of few and far between. But yeah, no, thank you for that.
Sure.
How about a piece of advice that you'd give someone that's trying to convince others to invest in customer feedback?
I think the best advice I could give on this one is questions always come up in the design of anything. And very often I have one opinion and you have another opinion. Back in the days before data-driven design, which is sort of where I feel like I kind of started in my career, it often came down to just really one person's preference versus another. And the final decision kind of came down to who's paying the bill or who's the most convincing or who yells the loudest or any number of other things like that. What you can really do by investing in customer feedback is that you can very quickly change the conversation. If you can really just spin up a test and come back with data, then suddenly it's not about my opinion versus your opinion. It's about, here's an idea, here's some data on how users responded, and based on that data, what actions are we going to take? And so you're really separating the sort of like personal quality of the question to a much more just scientific methods sort of decision that we can all have a much more productive conversation on, And I think especially when you look at like potentially like UI patterns that have been entrenched in an application for a long time, and there's just a strong pull to continue doing certain things because that's just the way our stakeholders are used to them, regardless of whether it could be improved, I think the most important thing is you can just fundamentally change the discussion and change the conversation by basing it on data as opposed to someone's feelings or opinions, which is an entirely different world.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of removing the opinions, removing the subjectivity from it.
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
And I mean, even that data introduces, especially if it's got customer feedback or something like that, everybody interprets it a little bit different.
Yeah, and you have to be willing to concede that you could be wrong, and that I mean, it happens, right? Even as designers with all of our years and years of instincts, I mean, we are wrong plenty of times. But I think the great thing about being a designer is it's kind of our job to, come up with ideas and try them out and then, pivot accordingly. So, I mean, I think, as you know more than anybody else probably, Janelle, I mean, you can spin a test in a way that it is useless, but like if you can actually run a test the right way and be neutral about the data and then have a real like just neutral conversation around what did we learn here, then I think everybody wins there, Yeah,
absolutely. So one last question, given we're in the experience space, if you're anything like I am, I'm like constantly evaluating the world around me and noticing bad things and noticing good things. So can you share a recent like great experience that you had?
Yeah, I think this is great because this is one of my favorite interview questions. So, interviewing potential hires. So this is an awesome question. Yeah, I had to think a little bit about this one, kind of comb through my phone and other things to sort of think about what was a great one recently. And I do have one, I'm happy to say, that really, really impressed me. And the cool thing about it is I had the chance recently to go to a design conference here in Utah. We call it the Front Conference. It's our UX and product industry conference. And a gentleman named Daniel Falabella, who's the director of product for Duolingo, was speaking there. And he gave a great talk and it was really compelling. And so when recently I kind of, as I have it many times in my life, had the urge to really focus on picking up another language, Duolingo was sort of at the top of my mind, pulled down their app. I have been just so impressed with all of the things that they have thought through in terms of making a language learning experience incredibly gamified and really like sticky. And it's just, there's so many just like little things that, you appreciate as a designer, that you see that like, that look almost effortless in their application. But I know, especially having listened to Daniel, that, they chewed on these things for a long time, and they're just really, they work. So I want to give a shout out to Duolingo. And I also want to give a shout out to Miro, which is another tool that we use for doing a lot of UX research analysis. But Miro is just one of those tools where when I got in there to use it, every keyboard shortcut, every place where my finger wanted to go, even with like copy pasting and all these different things, just worked the way I expected it to. And so I don't know whether they talked to a lot of Adobe Creative Suite customers, or they just kind of knew who their audience was, but it's always really, really nice when you get into a tool and it just kind of like fits like a glove, right? You don't have to spend a lot of time just banging your head against it. It just kind of works. And so those two.
Yeah, no, those are great. Those are great. I've heard many good things about Duolingo, and I can totally attest to Miro being something that's been amazing. That and Mural, during the remote working, and
yes,
see the shift to analysis moving from, back in the day when we used to put stickies
whiteboards,
on a wall,
sure,
right? Infinity diagramming. It's like,
yeah.
oh, now we can do that with a tool like Miro and Mural. It's like, that's a game changer.
That's right. That was the big driver for me too, to find those tools, was like, how can we take this thing that we used to do in a room and do it across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Andrew. Well, it was awesome having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. And, it's just so fun to talk about these things with people who appreciate the challenges and the ups and the downs of what we do. And so just grateful that you've created this space and connecting all of us design professionals to each other. So thank you.
Want to keep the conversation going? You can visit our podcast hub, usertesting.com/podcast, and check out past episodes. If you haven't already, don't forget to follow us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Overcast, or Google Play, so you can never miss a good episode. And if you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend or leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.